of the previous content, but I really tried to focus on surfacing other perspectives and in really encouraging them to think about just new ways of thinking about their topic and thinking about their research, things that they might not have previously considered. So some of the challenges and lessons learned with that, that first attempt, nobody responded to any of the posts. But when I was checking the logs, I could see that there were several students had gone through and they were reading them. And so then when I met with the instructor or a faculty member, one of the things we realized was that because this is new for a lot of students and they really need the time to digest the information. And when I had students make one-on-one appointments with me or send me emails outside of the forum, some of them stated that they felt uncomfortable with responding to these subjects in the class forum. So there was that feeling of they didn't want to say the wrong thing. And definitely that, we're all learning, but they wanted to message me directly to get help with their topic and to look at, to ask the questions that they might not feel comfortable doing where their other classmates could see them. And so I kind of realized that, okay, this topic is definitely new and that, they really needed the time to reflect and the time to process that. And just kind of realizing that through all of the messages that I got as soon as the forum was over. Some of the successes, though, were that they did come to me for the one-on-one support, so that the forum was a platform where they could speak to me and we could have those conversations about how they might be able to find Indigenous perspectives or find sources created by voices that might be underrepresented or might be marginalized and left out of the scholarly conversation. And the faculty member did share with me that the content that I created for the forum really spoke to the course objectives and it was well connected to their assignment. And I could see, again, as I mentioned, through the logs that they were coming back to that forum over the course of time. So even if they weren't engaging right off the bat, they were referring to that information and that it was useful for them to have it. So some of the takeaways from my first attempt at looking at this and trying to apply critical discourse analysis to this was that the faculty buy-in and support is really key. I needed to, there was a lot of collaboration and back and forth with the faculty member, the instructor ahead of time, because this content was going to be a little bit different than what I usually offer in an Ask the Librarian forum. And it was also helpful because this particular instructor is Indigenous. And so for me, it was a lot of learning as somebody who is not Indigenous, of just ways that I can be an ally and help to, just highlight some of those voices and some of those perspectives that students may not otherwise encounter when they're doing their research. Another thing that was a takeaway was creating that safe space for discussion. And so that's kind of connected to the time to digest the information. So for my second attempt, which will be with doctoral students and the same instructor, instead of offering the support for 3 days or 5 days in 1 week, it'll be integrated throughout the term because really the students need the opportunity to engage in their own critical reflection. A lot of this content does challenge the status quo and the ways that they've learned to think about their research, and not that any of that is wrong, but in terms of helping them to or encouraging them to look at other perspectives, they need the time to make that meaningful for themselves too, and to reflect on that as well. So having more time to offer that support and have it sustained over a longer period of time, I think is going to be important for the second attempt. Continuing just to connect it to their upcoming assignments, and for me to remember that if I can maybe add more activities in or add some discussion questions to make the forum more interactive, that might increase engagement. And the biggest takeaway is that as a person who is not Indigenous, that this is definitely lifelong learning. It involves a lot of learning from others, hopefully from students and other instructors. So it's a project in progress, but I'm hoping to learn throughout, and I'm hoping that the second attempt that there is more engagement, and that I become more comfortable with challenging my own views as well, and learning to use this research method. And you said we'll take questions at the end, so that is it, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Davina. And now on to Emily.
Great, thank you, David, and hi, everyone. I'm grateful to be joining today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I want to thank, first of all, the organizers, panelists, and other lightning talk presenters for all of their work today, and for the opportunity to share one of the projects we've been working on to address racism in our collections. So I'll be speaking about the Critical Literacy Kit project that I'm involved with at the UBC Education Library. But I want to say up front that this has by no means been a solo effort. What started at the Education Library very quickly became a collaborative project with librarians, student librarians, and iSchool professional experience students at 3 other UBC library branches, Weewa, Okanagan, and Rare Books and Special Collections. And I know some of my collaborators are here today as well, so hi to all of you. This project has been ongoing for about 1.5 years now at the Education Library, and it expanded about a year ago to those 3 other branches, where we all had a shared interest and a similar issue that we felt needed addressing. So all of those branches that I've mentioned have something in common, which is that to different extents, we have children's literature in our collections. And to be more specific, we all have children's literature that is by and or about Indigenous peoples. And what we found at Education that motivated us to get started with this project is that these books can be, perhaps unsurprisingly, highly problematic for a number of reasons. They may be completely inaccurate. They can include racist and stereotypical tropes. They may include traditional stories or characters that are being depicted inappropriately or without proper permission. And this often occurs because they're being told by authors who are not themselves Indigenous or are not members of the nation or community being depicted in the stories. So this became a real problem that we thought needed addressing, in large part because the Indigenous children's literature collections that we have serve multiple user groups, all with very different priorities and reasons for seeking out these materials. So on the one hand, we have teacher candidates, we have faculty, practicing teachers, parents, caregivers, all coming in every day seeking Indigenous children's literature to read with children in classrooms and in homes. And we certainly didn't want them coming in and finding these problematic materials and using them for that purpose. But on the other hand, because we're an academic library where there's a lot of research being done, we know that there are some folks out there studying historical depictions of topics like Indigenous representations in educational texts and children's literature. And so doing something like completely weeding these problematic texts out of the collection, though it could be a simple solution, could impede that kind of research. So we as librarians are aware of our reasons for keeping these kinds of materials to serve that research mandate, but we know that many of our users don't factor that in when they're exploring the collection and when they're choosing books for their teaching. So we wanted to find a way to kind of share that message to ensure that students weren't taking these harmful and racist stories into classrooms with them under the assumption that our having them in the collection was sort of a sign that they were appropriate for that use. So in the early stages of the project, we really wanted to find a way to mediate access to these problematic items and to make sure users are aware of the problems. And as a secondary goal that emerges that we wanted to find out if we could take it a step further and repurpose these materials as tools in our instruction to encourage users to think more critically when evaluating and selecting Indigenous children's literature for teaching. So we wanted to find a way to actually make use of these materials in our instruction with education students. And in doing some research early on in the project, for which we had a great professional experience student, Hannah, to assist, we wanted to know if there was already research out there with recommendations for managing problematic materials in libraries and what other librarians have been doing. And we found that as expected, weeding problematic books was a very common recommendation. However, we noticed that this was coming most often from public and K-12 school libraries. So there may not be that research mandate in those spaces. And we also felt that weeding these materials and going with that recommendation could really just serve to erase our own history of collecting problematic and racist materials. And we felt that keeping them and making that decision to keep them and engage closely with them in a project like this was an opportunity for us as librarians to also do our own learning around this topic, to get a sense of just how harmful so many of the materials we've included in our collections are, and to get better at recognizing problematic literature to avoid continuing to add those materials to the collection. And in the research, when it came to academic libraries managing problematic materials, there was one practice that we found had been written about a fair bit that was referred to as catalog record enhancement. So the recommendation here was to add notes in the catalog records of problematic books. And in these cases, most often they used bad books to refer to fraudulent or falsified works, as opposed to specifically looking at racist materials. But they recommended adding these notes as an opportunity to caution readers about the content in the text. But even these authors would often acknowledge that record enhancements or adding notes to books alone may not be sufficient, noting that a lot of users may miss these. And some even touched on our second goal for the project, suggesting that more could be done to increase learning through critical engagement with these materials. So our next phase was to determine if we could find a way to manage these materials that also address the need for more explicit critical literacy instruction. And we hope to do that by turning these items into what we now call critical literacy kits. So at Education, we have now developed or are in the process of developing 5 of these kits, each with a different theme. The themes we chose emerged from our assessment of our Indigenous children's literature collection in the branch and the recurring problems, stereotypes, and tropes that we found in those books. So the 5 themes that emerged were depictions of cultural appropriation in children's books, traditional Indigenous stories being misidentified or framed as myths, fairy tales, or folklore, the vanishing Indian trope in which Indigenous peoples are treated only as historical figures, the noble, savage, or ecological Indian trope, and finally, colonization being framed as exploration or contact. And the contents of each kit include 10 to 15 problematic books from the Indigenous children's collection that exemplify the kit's theme. We include a handout that introduces the topic of critical literacy and the specific theme of each kit. We have a book list with authentic Indigenous or own voices picture books from the collection that could be used and sought out as alternative text to counter the problematic narratives and images found in the books or in the kit's contents. And we include a document with suggested learning activities for use by librarians or other educators when using the critical literacy kits in teaching. And here is what 2 of those kits look like. So we have the depictions of cultural appropriation and the traditional stories kits there. In the last academic year, I was then able to use the books and learning activities from the kits with education students to lead workshops about evaluating and selecting Indigenous education resources. This is at the request of one of the instructors teaching their Aboriginal Education in Canada course, who had an assignment in which students were asked to evaluate lesson plans and learning resources about Indigenous peoples, to critique the lesson plans and note any problems that they would have to improve upon in their own teaching. So when she heard about these kits we were making, she really liked the idea of making use of these materials as a way of preparing students to engage with that assignment and to discuss some of the problematic elements they may encounter in lesson plans and teacher resources they came across. So during those workshops, education students were provided with a series of critical literacy questions to ask and discuss as they explored one of the books from the kits. And they were also asked to investigate the author's background and positionality in relation to the topic that was being written about in the story. And as a third activity, we asked students to note a few of the problems in the text and to create footnotes to inform future readers